we have already been testing our application on an Android simulator. And before moving forward into testing it on an iOS simulator as well, I wanted to touch on something that you may have already noticed. And that is that we cannot create Android simulators running version 26 of the Android API, which is Android Oreo or higher. And that is because as of that version, Google has just removed the GUI interfaces for the Android SDK and the AVD Manager or Android Virtual Device Manager. Thankfully, Microsoft and Xamarin have created very similar versions of these tools, still GUIs, graphic user interfaces, which we can now start to use instead of the legacy programs that Google provided. So the first thing that we have to do to make sure that we can create new Android Oreo or higher Android emulators is to open our Visual Studio installer. Now, this first step is not necessary in the case of Mac. So if you are running on Mac, you can skip a couple of minutes into this video until we have the SDK Manager open. Because in the case of Visual Studio for Mac, this is already installed so long as you have the latest version of the IDE. In the case of Windows, you will have to perform an additional step. Once the Visual Studio installer has been started, you will have to modify your current Visual Studio installation. All you have to do is click on the More section inside of your current installation of Visual Studio and select Modify. In the Modifying window, you will have to navigate to the Individual Components tab. And in here, you will have to search for Xamarin SDK Manager inside the Development Activities section. Make sure that it is selected before continuing. And if it wasn't selected, make sure that you click on the Modify button so it is installed along with Visual Studio. Once the installation has completed, you will have to navigate back to Visual Studio. Under the Tools menu, you will find Android, and you will now find the Android SDK Manager. In the case of Visual Studio for Mac, the option is inside of the Tools menu as well, but right inside of that menu without having to navigate to another one. Inside of this new SDK Manager created by Xamarin is from where we are going to have access to pretty much the same things we had access before with Google's SDK Manager. As you can see, it looks a little bit different, but you will have pretty much the same tools. In here, I want you to make sure that you navigate to the Tools tab and that under Android SDK Tools, you select the Android SDK tool that is version 26 or higher. This is going to be very important for us to install the Xamarin Device Manager, which is going to replace the Android Device Manager, from which we are going to be able to create emulators for Android version 26 or higher. So once you have selected Android SDK Tools version 26 or higher, make sure that you click on the Apply Changes button. You may see this window with the license acceptance. Of course, you will have to click on Accept, and the changes will be performed. First, the previous version of the Android SDK will be installed, and then the newer version is going to be added to your operating system. In addition to the SDK tools, you may need to make sure that the Android SDK Platform Tools has installed a version higher than the 26th, and that inside the Android SDK Build Tools, you have installed one of the latest SDK Build Tools for version 26 at least. For example, currently I have the 26.0.2 version installed. I should consider now selecting the version 26.0.3 and removing the previous version that I had. And that's it. Now you will be able to launch the installer for your corresponding operating system. So in the resources for this video, you're going to see both the link to download the installer for Windows as well as to download the installer for Mac. The installer, which is going to look like this, is of course going to navigate you through installing the new Xamarin Android Device Manager in your computer. This is a basic installation, nothing out of the ordinary. To open the Xamarin Android Device Manager, you will have to do it on Windows with administrator mode. So you can right click on it, select More, and select Run as Administrator. And like I mentioned, this is going to allow you to create new Android virtual devices just like previously, but it will also now allow you to create devices that run Android 8.0 or higher, which isn't possible anymore in previous version of the device managers. Provided, of course, that you have installed the corresponding tools, you will now be able to create new Android virtual devices in here and see them listed on Visual Studio just like you would with any other virtual device. So now you will be able to create Android devices, Android simulators that run Android 8.0 Oreo or higher, something that you cannot create with other GUIs. Actually, the only way that you could create it if you didn't install this was with a command line.